I probably am going to have to read parts of these things because when I get a little stressed, it seems like my mind wants to go blank. I think I'm getting older.
Can I introduce you first as far as a couple of stellar statistics? So she's been going to Applegate ever since the beginning. And if you're related to Kareen, can you stand up? Yeah. Come on, I know there's a few of you. Yeah. 7 children, 28 grandchildren, 55 great-grandchildren, and 2 on the way. So, and this is Kareen, and if you don't know her, you've probably seen her around for many years. Yes. And I just have had the privilege of knowing her for a long time, and if you were here back when I was raising kids, we got to go to her house and learn how to make pies and cinnamon rolls. So just know that she is a rich store of information. So this is any of the stories that she tells, we're going to be able to have questions and answers, and there's also pictures, photo album on the back table if you want to look at them afterwards. So
I just want you to see the cabin that we moved into with 3 kids. It was pretty small, and I had a wood cook stove.
Yes. So do you want to start us out with how you came to know the Lord?
Actually, I was probably in about the 2nd grade, and I was raised Catholic, and we went to church every Sunday, but I don't think I heard about him until I was about in the 2nd grade. Mm-hmm. And I decided I wanted to devote my life to him at that time. I just didn't have any teaching for, I don't know, till I was probably about 30. Other than the fact that my husband was a Christian, and he was born again. Mm-hmm. I don't know how he ever looked at me where I was. You know how that goes? So anyway,
with stars in his eyes.
Yes. Yeah, well, speaking of stars in your eyes, it was kind of funny because we were good friends, but he was about almost 9 years older than me, so I never really looked at him. And one evening he was at the house, and we were just visiting around the kitchen table, the whole family, and he asked me a question, and I glanced over, and we looked into each other's eyes, and we both knew.
Oh, that's so sweet. And how old were you at the time?
I was about 18, I think.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah. So anyway, that's how that went.
Okay.
And we were married in Minden, Nevada, and the reason was because he had been through the war, and he had been wounded in the war, and he just didn't want to be around crowds, and so he didn't want a big wedding. So we were married in Minden, and then we went over to visit his folks, and his dad was elated. He thought it was awesome that he had finally gotten married. And his mother wasn't quite so elated. And it's kind of interesting because I have, you know, the old saying, which is, a daughter is a daughter for life, but a son is a son till he takes a wife. And being a mother-in-law is a real challenge, too. And as a mother-in-law several times over, and the Lord has impressed on me to let my kids learn to fight their own battles. Mm-hmm. So I stay out of the marriages completely.
Wise.
I just pray for them. Mm-hmm. So. Okay, I wanted to start with this little story. We were living down in LA because there was no work available around Medford, and so we had moved down there. And we were living in a 23-foot older mobile home in a mobile home park. And so we were paying on our car, we were paying on the mobile home, we were paying rent, you know, to the park. And it seemed like there was never enough money. We were always broke. And I had gone to the store to pick up some things, and I was pushing the stroller with our little girl, who was probably about 2 at the time, and I was expecting our second child, and I was pushing the stroller home, and I was thinking to myself, is this all there is to life? Is this the way it's going to be all the rest of my life? Have I made a mistake? And this little voice, I know it was the Lord, said, just a second. Who are you to be so important that your happiness is more important than your husband, your children, and the rest of your family? And of course, when the Lord speaks to you, you know what he means, and you know what you have to do. And so that night, I went home, and when each time that those thoughts would try to come to my mind, I would go over and give my husband a hug and tell him how much I loved him. My situation didn't change, but my attitude did. So. So this is another story that happened when we're down there. My husband worked swing shift the whole time we were down in L.A. And so when he would get home from work, I would fix his breakfast for him, and it would, be about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I noticed a couple of nights he brought home a friend, and he introduced me to him, and I fixed breakfast for them too. And then finally he told me, he said, we get together, the 3 guys that had visited, we get together and we talk about our wives. And he said, I told them that you always got up and fixed my breakfast for me, and they didn't believe me. Okay, so we lived there for about 3.5 years, and then we decided that we were expecting our 3rd child, and we decided that we either had to get a bigger mobile home, or we had to buy a house, or we had to sell and go back to Oregon. So that's what we did. And we lived with my folks for a couple of weeks while we looked around, and we finally found this little place out on Sterling Creek. And the pasture was beautiful, the place was beautiful. But the only trouble was the house had burned the year before, and so the neighbors had gotten together and built a little 14 by 16 cabin for the old man to live in. And we looked at it, and we loved the place, and I told my husband, if you can stand it, I can stand it. So, and just having come out of the 23-foot mobile home, we actually, it wasn't too bad because we had been so crowded in there anyway. And,
14 by 16?
Yep.
Anybody else have a house smaller than that?
And I've got a picture of it over there.
Yeah.
And it had a wood kitchen stove, and I used that wood kitchen stove until just recently. I finally gave it to my son, and he's got it at his house. But I cooked on that. I canned that year and everything in the summertime, and you just only get so hot. You can't get any hotter. You're just dripping. But I canned probably close to 1,000 quarts of pears and peaches, and you could go into the orchard in those days and pick up fruit off the ground, and after the pickers had gone through, and it didn't cost you anything. And of course, you lost a part of your peach, but you got a lot of good too. So that's what I did that year.
Did you also start gardening at that time?
And I did. I started a garden, of course, right away. And,
did your canned food, was that pretty much your winter store?
yes, it was.
So you had to have that.
Right.
It wasn't just for fun.
No, it wasn't just for fun. You got a bunch
Guilty.
of kids eating,
Yeah.
and they would go through a quart of peaches in one sitting, and so So anyway, when we moved out there, it was like the Lord had me in isolation so he could teach me things. And our nearest neighbor was about a mile away. And so I didn't have anyone to tell me I had a right to something, or that I deserved better or that I was being taken advantage of. And I'm so glad I didn't, because I don't think I would have heard the Lord, because it was when I was being taken advantage of that the Lord spoke to me and would teach me something. Just because things don't go the way you think they should doesn't mean it's not the Lord's will. So,
Good. Right.
and this is Earl enjoyed hunting. His greatest desire was for us as a family to go on hunting trips. I really was not interested in hunting, but because that was his desire, I chose to get interested. We hunted to put food on the table and not for sport. And he got to go elk hunting. I got to go elk hunting with him twice before he wasn't able to go anymore.
So Earl is your husband of how many years?
We were married for almost 40 years. Yeah. So.
And then can I ask, so this was when he was how old, and you had how many kids at home when you were talking about when he went elk hunting? Or was that every year? Or
No, he got to go deer hunting, of course, because that was local. And elk hunting, I've got a story about an elk hunt that's pretty good. He'd been able to go elk hunting one fall and got a spike. And he had told me that he was going to go again the next year. And about March, he reminded me and I said nothing because I just couldn't see how we could afford to have him go elk hunting. And then again in August, he reminded me again, and I told him I don't see how we can afford it. The kids have gone barefoot all summer, and they all need shoes, and they need some clothes for school. And he said he had worked all year long to care for us, and he felt like he deserved this. And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, what about me? I worked 24 but I didn't say it. And he was in hopes that he might put meat on the table, which was good. But anyway, I began to be quiet. I just didn't think it fair. I never had any time off. About 2 weeks before the time, I was looking out the window and talking to the Lord about how unfair it was. And he spoke to me and he said, what you need to do is go to him and apologize. Apologize? For being quiet. He is, after all, he is a good husband. You don't want to be mad at each other while he's gone. So I thought about it for a minute, and it made sense. So that evening, before the kids realized he was home, I went out and I caught him and I said, I still don't think you should go, but I don't want us mad at each other while you are gone. So I'll do everything I can to help cut costs. Boy, what a relief. That heavy load was on my shoulders was gone, and I didn't have to be mad anymore. It was a 4-day trip, and they planned to arrive, hunt, set up, camp, and then rest, hunt, and then have the whole next day for hunting. And then the next day they would have to head home. So I did all I could to help. I baked, made stew, and whatever else I could do. And the last day they had to get a load of wood. His 2 buddies came out to help. They went up Armstrong Gulch, and they didn't come back. They figured they'd be back by 10 o'clock. And they didn't come, and finally walking down the road, stuck. They got the pickup stuck with a load of wood on it. So they got the other guy's pickup and they went back up. A couple hours later, they're come walking back down again. They got it stuck. And they called the other guy's wife to bring their car, and he took it up, and they were gone for a long time, and finally, here they all came. Apparently, they had gotten the car stuck for a while, too. So. But they had planned on leaving about 10 a.m., and it's now about 10 o'clock p.m. So they threw off the wood, loaded everything in, and took off. They had a 55-gallon drum of gas to use over where they were going to be hunting. And getting started so late, and everything closed, the gas stations and all. So they stopped, probably, anyway, that long straight section in eastern Oregon where there's nothing but little towns. And they stopped and pumped some gas from the barrel, and then they took off, and they went about 50 feet, and it died. They waited a couple of minutes and started and took off again, and it went about 50 feet, and then it died again. This went on for about 6 miles to a small town, and there was a gas station, but it was closed, and the sign on the door said mechanic on duty at 6 o'clock. It's now about 4 o'clock. Finally, the guy gets there, and he goes all through the gas lines, carburetor, cleans all, they take off again. They're about a mile out of town, and it starts doing it again. They limp back to town, and he goes through it again. They take off, same thing happens, and they limp back. He goes through it all again, and they take off. They had decided by this time that if it did it again, they would turn around and go home. They had lost the morning and the evening hunt, and for just one day, it wouldn't be worth it. It did it again. They walked back and had the mechanic tow it back in. And it goes all the way through it again, then remembered something else, and they take off for home. Not one problem coming home. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I had gotten my washing started. My washing machine was outside at that time, and I had to pull it out from under the eaves. And then, of course, there was a chair with a square tub on it that I rinsed the clothes in, and I had gotten started washing. And I was just taking a basket up the hill to my clothesline, and I was praying that they would enjoy themselves and have a good time and have a good hunt. Then I hear a car coming up the road, and it sounded like our pickup. It was. I truly felt badly for him. He hugged me. I think he was glad to be home. And thinking back, I think he would have canceled the trip when I apologized, except for his 2 buddies were depending on him. So, needless to say, both of us learned a lot out of that one. Okay, so this is during this time that he was working up on the freeway. They were putting the freeway through at that time, and he was working 10-hour shifts, and it would take him an hour to go to work and an hour home. So I was always trying to find things that I could do to help him so he didn't have to work so hard when he was home. And so I found out that I could get 2x4s that were 4 foot long at the mill at Murphy. And so I started going over and getting a load of the 2x4s. The kids would help me load. And this one particular day, it was quite hot, and the kids had really been big helpers, and we got it loaded and started back. And I thought, well, it's so hot, I'm going to stop at Cantrell Buckley and let the kids play in the water a little bit and cool off. So we did, and we were on this side of the bridge. There was a place where a cat had gone down to the water, and so there was kind of a path there for us to get down to the water. And there was a little island about 10 or 12 feet out in the water, and the water in between was maybe this deep. It wasn't very deep. And so I felt it was fairly safe, and so the kids were going back and forth. And Gina was about 7 months old at that time, and I was holding her on my lap. And our youngest little boy was about 3, and he was playing with the kids, and he slipped on a rock, and down he went in the water, and there was just enough pressure behind the water that it was pushing him right out into the deep place where people were diving. And here I'm sitting with this baby in my lap, and I said, oh my dear God, help. I knew I wouldn't get the kids' attention to come and watch the baby, so I just turned around and laid her on the rocks knowing when I got back I was going to have to take her out of the water too. I figured she'd be in it by that time because she was screaming and wanting to turn over. And by the time I got to Brad, I had seen him come up twice, and then the third time I grabbed him and got him back and was going as fast as I could. And I got back there and I could still hear Gina screaming, trying to roll over. God had provided a cleft in the rock, and I had laid her right in it, and she could not turn over. That was a really special thing. Needless to say, I herded him back up and got him into the pickup, and we went home. This is one that was kind of... Brad was the youngest of the 4 boys, and it seemed like he got left out of a lot of stuff because he was the youngest. So this one particular time, our neighbor wanted to go hunting in eastern Oregon, and he invited Earl and the 3 older boys to go with him. And so Brad didn't get to go again. So I told Brad, we'll get up early tomorrow morning and we'll go across the road and go hunting. So that kind of satisfied him. And so the next morning we got up, and I got my rifle, and we went up on the mountain, and we hunted, and we didn't see anything. No deer, no nothing. And then we were just about to quit. It was about 10 o'clock. And I told him, I'm going to go up to the top of this draw. When I whistle, I want you to come up through the draw and see if you can spook something. So I did, and I went up to the top, and I whistled, and I could hear him starting to come up through the brush. And about this time, this deer jumped. Now, this is the first time I'd ever been hunting by myself, and I'd never shot anything before.
So you were armed, right?
I was armed, yes, I had my rifle.
Okay.
And I hear this deer jump, and I could see it was a buck. I could see the horns. And then it jumped and went up a path, and this little voice back here says, if you just move over a couple of feet, you could look right up that path. And so I did, and I looked up the path, and sure enough, the deer was standing there, and he was broadside to me. And so I pulled up the rifle, and without thinking of the fact that I was standing on the hillside, you know, a pretty steep hillside. And so I pulled the trigger, and the deer just dropped, and I almost dropped too, almost knocked me over. And then I thought, oh my goodness, now what do? I haven't got a knife to cut the throat, you know, so you could bleed it out. And then I went on up the hill and to the deer, and I know the Lord aimed and took the shot, because there's no way I could have done it, because it broke his neck and cut his throat at the same time. And about this time, Brad comes running up, and he says, Mama, I just got through praying that the God would help you, and that he would jump a deer for you, and that he'd help you get it. So
that's your prayer.
That was quite a thing.
Yes.
And then, well, we dragged the deer back down the hill, and I could hear Gina had gotten up, or Janet, had gotten up, and she was playing with Monica and Gina over at the house. And I yelled at her to bring the wheelbarrow over, which she did, and then we loaded it in that and brought it home and hung it out behind the house. And then the other guys came home the next day, and Brad went out of the house. Of course, did you get anything? No, they hadn't gotten anything. We did. And of course, my husband thought it was the most wonderful thing. He was really proud of it.
So do I remember that I love that you took an interest in your husband's hunting, even though it was not your first choice. But then you also learned to take care of it after somebody brought one home. So how did you learn that? So you learned how to...
Watching the others.
Dress it and butcher it and put it in the freezer.
I didn't skin it. Bruce was always, whenever anybody got a deer and got it hung up, he starts skinning it. So I just let him skin it, but I did clean it.
But you learned the rest.
Of course, that's not too different than doing a chicken or...
I've never done a chicken. Anybody here done a chicken?
A little bigger. Okay, so now Eric was, he was our third son, and he was 12 at this time, and he was hiking up on the Sterling Ditch, and he suddenly realized that there was a whole bunch of eyes watching him, and he kind of glanced around, and he apparently had stumbled into a snake den, and there were a lot of rattlesnakes with him. And so he very carefully backed up, and then he took off and ran down to the house, and his eyes were as big as saucers when he came in. And then my husband thought that was pretty neat, and some way or another they heard that you could get like $5 a foot for live rattlesnakes. And so they wanted to catch some rattlesnakes because there was quite a few of them, which they did do, and they had it was a big tank that was about 4 foot high, and it was about 6 feet long and about 4 feet wide. And they had a big, I don't know where they got the window, but it was a big window that they would set on top of it. And they'd started catching these snakes. My husband taught them how to do it by, he wasn't able to go with him, but he told them how to do it with a stick and a string with a noose on it, and he dropped the noose down and get the snake's head in it, and and then they would put him in a paper feed bag, which the paper feed bags are generally 2 or 3 thicknesses of paper plus a plastic thickness also. And when the snake was inside of the sack, it couldn't bite the sack because it was too slick. And so they would tie it at the top then and bring the snakes down and put them in this pen. Needless to say, I didn't have any mice for years. But anyway, this one particular time, Eric had a feed bag with snakes in it tied on a stick out behind us, and he was coming down to the house with the snakes. And a cop stopped him because he didn't have a helmet on. He was barefoot.
Was he on a motorcycle?
He was on a motorcycle. And the cop stopped him and asked him what he had in the bag, and he told him rattlesnakes, and the cop just rolled up the window and drove off. One thing I did learn about the rattlesnakes, though, is they're not vicious, or at least ours aren't. I know in some areas they are. But unless you stepped on them or got too close, they would try to get away. And kind of relieved my... In fact, when we would have company come, the rattlesnakes that were in the pen would rattle like crazy, but if it was just us walking around, they didn't pay any attention to us. It was kind of interesting.
Did they end up selling them?
They ended up selling them, but for $1 a piece.
Oh.
They had 47, I think, at the time. And the biggest one was 53 inches long.
Wow.
So. This wasn't my idea, of course, doing all this.
You were a praying mom, right?
Yes, very definitely. Then this particular story happened after the fellowship had started. It was pretty small yet, but we were having a Bible study at our house. This was in December, and there was snow on the ground, and it was frozen. And we were having this Bible study, and the dogs just kept barking like crazy outside, so I finally sent the boys out to find out what was wrong. And they came back in, and it was moonlight out, and they were just going by moonlight. And when they came in, they said it looked like it was a big monkey. It was kind of crouched down like a big monkey. And so they got a flashlight and went back out. And it was a naked hippie. So they came back and got him some towels and a blanket and stuff and brought him in. And we put him in the utility room because he was nearly frozen. And we called 911, and they came and got him. But he was telling my son the next day, he told him that he had been on drugs and he got too hot. And so he took his clothes off and got into the irrigation ditch, which had melted snow water in it, and tried to cool off. And then he realized that he was in trouble. And so then the only thing he could see was this light down at the bottom of the hill from our Bible study. So, and the next morning when my son went in and got him and took him somewhere, and he shared with him, and he accepted the Lord at that time. And I know he was sincere because I could see the difference after that. But anyway, okay, so here we go again. Janet was about 12 or 13 at this time, and I began to get a little depressed of not being able to have any. We had 6 kids in one bedroom, and Janet was the oldest, and I felt like she needed some kind of privacy at that time. And it began to eat on me because nothing was done, and my husband agreed, but there was nothing done. And of course, I think he was overwhelmed. But anyway, it began to take my joy, and I got quiet. And a couple of more years, and I didn't see how it could be God's will for us to live this way. We had started building, but nothing done for months. Earl began to notice his breathing was bad, and he finally went to the doctor. At first, they thought it was an infection, and it turned out to be emphysema. And 23% of his lungs left, which wasn't very much. And they told him that he had about 10 years. And the Lord spoke to my heart. My priorities were wrong. What more important than a nice house or a husband? My circumstances didn't change again, but my attitude did. And that happened before he was totally disabled, which he was actually disabled then, but he kept working because it was the only job available, and he had a wife and 6 kids to take care of. And
so you were on Sterling Creek at the time.
yes.
And you were building a house. It was in
Yes.
progress.
We were
It was
starting on
working.
the 2-story part of the house. We were still living in the 3 rooms, but okay, so now the new church is starting, and we were going to both services in the summer because the Rouge Community Church was at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the fellowship was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so we could go to both. And that was fine all during the summer, but in the fall, they were going to go into the, we were meeting out in the park, and then they were going to go into the gym for the winter. And so they changed it, and they started having it at 10 o'clock also. So I had to make up my mind which church I wanted to go to. So I asked my husband what he thought and which church he thought I ought to go to. And he said that I should go to the one that taught me, that I could get the most out of his teachings. So we went to the first one at the Rouge Community Church, which I will say is a very good church. I like it. But the pastor that was teaching was going into Revelation. Both churches were at that time. And told us all of the different books that we should get so that we could study the book of Revelation. And then I went to the second service, and he just picked up the Bible and started teaching it. So needless to say, I switched churches about that time. And in so doing, I left a very comfortable situation. I had a lot of friends at the church, and it was kind of a hard thing to do, but it was well worth it. And the Lord promised me I would have just as many friends, if not more, at the new church. So.
And was your husband going with you at the time?
My husband never went to church with me, but he was a believer, and he loved the Lord passionately, but he just couldn't stand to be around crowds. And I guess there are a lot of guys that are like that. But I was always in hopes that he would go, but he never could.
So you always took the kids?
I took the kids.
He was
To
good
start
that.
with, we sent them with a neighbor. And then the Lord, that's coming up.
Oh, that's coming. Okay, we'll wait for it.
Okay. Earl was working with a young man, and they became good friends. They had 4 kids, and we had 6. And we visited back and forth. The little gal's name was Willie, and she had married at 16 and had had a rocky marriage. They would have an argument, and he would take off, leaving her with the 4 little kids. We tried to help her with food as living on the farm, and I canned everything I could get my hands on, but short financially. He would be gone for 3 or 4 weeks, and then he'd call and ask her if she missed him and wanted him back, until the next time. And then it would happen again. She finally got disgusted, and they split. He said the little girl was hers, the 3 boys were his. She got a job at Walker the Weeper, cleaning mobile homes and driving flag car for wide loads down from Portland. Because she was alone a lot, she carried a small pistol in her glove compartment. And she had a babysitter for Monica who lived next door. Occasionally, I would have her. She finally saved enough money to get a divorce, and one day she had come out to see me, and during the conversation, she asked me if anything ever happened to her, would we be willing to take Monica and raise her as our own? I told her I definitely would, but she needed to talk to Earl about that because he was the breadwinner. So a day or 2 later, she talked to Earl, and he said yes. Nothing in writing. Then she started dating a young man, and they got engaged. One evening, day after Christmas, they had a little argument, and she got in the car and left. He took Monica to the neighbors, intending to follow her. He didn't know where she had gone. And she drove out to the Applegate. I think she was coming to see me. And going across the bridge, she slid in the ice and landed in a field. The young man behind her stopped to see if he could help, and she said she was okay, so he went home to get his dad. When they got back, she had shot herself. Next morning, I was busy getting things picked up after getting Earl off to work. Excuse me just a minute. I had a telephone call, and he identified himself as sheriff. Told me I'd better sit down. I was in shock, but asked what about Monica. They didn't know. So I told him about her, and that we finally found her. I told them of the promise we had made, and we had to call child welfare. A lady from there, a caseworker, came out. Kids were sleeping in the new part of the house, no inside walls, and keeping house in the old part. She took me in, and we got Monica and brought her out. I was made her guardian, and they took care of notifying Willie's dad and stepmom and 2 sisters down in L.A. Her dad came up to take care of the funeral. 2 weeks later, back with the stepmom to get Monica. We told him of Willie's wishes and told him that we didn't know what was best for her, but God did, so we would let the judge decide, and we would abide by that. We knew with 6 kids already and no indoor bathrooms, and all our chances were pretty slim, but we truly wanted God's will. They stayed the weekend, spending all day Saturday and again on Sunday with us. On Sunday, they said they would go down and sign for us to adopt. My husband and I both knew Saturday night they were going to do this. It was like the Lord even told us what they were going to say. It was amazing.
Wow. So you adopted her, and she was how old?
She was just turned 6. This is some scriptures and stuff.
Whoops. That's all right. Get it.
This all happened with Monica at the same time that my husband was down where he couldn't do anything. And then, let's see. Okay, well, this is pretty important, so I better get with it. At first, Earl was able to go places with me. As he got worse, he couldn't go, as the vibrations of the car seemed to suck the air out of him. At this time, I still was going to church, and once a month for groceries and bills. Was also delivering my pies and cinnamon rolls to the 2 restaurants that I was selling them to. He had been ill for 10 years, and he was still here. He got angry. His hearing was also going, he was so angry that he was shaking. Finally, I got him calmed down, and he told me he was hearing half conversations and finishing them in his own mind. And when I talked on the phone facing the wall, he thought I didn't want him to hear. It was a wall phone, so so he thought I was having an affair. And he didn't want anyone to come visit, even our kids and family. I told him that was okay except the kids. The Lord whispered in my ear, "You can have victory over this with love." So doing dishes, I would stop and dry my hands and hug him and tell him how much I loved him. I told him I loved him. I made it a point to turn around and face him when on the phone. After a couple of months of doing whatever I could, he thanked me. It still took about a year to finally get him completely out of it. During this time, I remember asking God, "Where is my witness, Lord? I never see anyone." As he grew more ill and he couldn't get around at all, I had an old oak office swivel chair with casters, and I'd get him in it and wheel him out into the kitchen for a couple of hours. And then he had to rest, and I'd wheel him back into the bedroom. During this time, I made a lot of braided rugs, and we visited, and I'd go outside and work in the garden or flower beds. Could only be out for about 15 or 20 minutes at a time. One time in the summer, I had put a nylon sleeping bag on the bed for his nap because it was cooler. He was turning over and slid right off onto the floor. He wasn't hurt, so covered him up so he wouldn't get chilled. And Eric, who lived up the road from us, stopped by almost every afternoon on his way home. And in about an hour, he showed up, and we got him back into bed. So, well, let's see, this would be first. I was taking the best care I could of the irrigation and the animals that we had left, the garden and the yard. The boys were married, so it was just me. My knees were really bothering me. I believe it was arthritis, and they had become quite swollen. I thought about going in and having them pray and anoint me with oil, but I put it off, figuring Earl needed it worse. Finally, a little voice coaxed me into it. After church, I waited, and the only elder available was a gentleman who came to Bible study at our house, and he was married. I didn't like the way he looked at our 2 daughters, so I didn't want to go to him. A little voice says, "He has nothing to do with the healing." So very humbly, I asked him to pray for me, and he got another gentleman, took me aside, anointed me with oil, and prayed. I got home, I didn't feel any different, but a little voice says, "If you're healed, you need to take off your elastic bandages." And I was thinking, but they'll just get worse. Then I did take them off, and within a week I was healed. It really was. Excuse me just for a second. When you get old, your nose tends to run for no reason. There was a forest fire on the hill across the road, and so I had gotten my hoses out, and I had the ladder up, and I was just ready to go up on the roof and start watering things down, because I figured if it came our way, it was going to burn the electric wires, and we wouldn't have water then. So I was going to go up on the roof and start watering everything down real good. And about that time, some elders from the church came to help. I just hadn't gotten up on the top yet. And I figured if it came our way, it was better to get things wet down. And I knew I wouldn't be able to put Earl in a car to move him, so I figured if it came our way, somehow I would get him up to the pond, and we would get in the pond, which wasn't too far from the house. But the Lord caused it to crest and then turn and go the other way. Crested on the hill across from us. So. So now you're probably wondering about Monica's dad. It was about 2 years after we had adopted Monica, we got a call from her dad. He was in town and wondered where Willie and Monica were. Earl had him come out, and he did, and we told him everything that had happened. He was shocked. Think he really loved Willie, just didn't know how to be a husband. Was glad we had Monica. He and Monica's grandparents did not like each other. I really believe if they had gotten her, he would have kidnapped her. He really respected Earl. I also think he would have given us the boys, but Earl was in no condition to take on 3 more ages 10, 12, and 14 who had been raised like they had. Robin was into drugs, free sex, and all of that. A couple of weeks later, he was back with his boys, moved into an old cabin a couple of miles from us. It worried me a little, but I knew God was in control. He wanted to take Monica in and buy her a lot of things, and we told him it would be better if he didn't. She was our responsibility, and the kids were all pretty much square in what they had. He seemed to understand. He lived there about 6 months, and then he moved up Yale Creek with the boys. Often another man was with him, different each time. He would stop by 3 or 4 times a week and visit with Earl. Finally got a phone call from a good friend who lived near where Robin and the kids were living. He said, "Did you know the police are watching your place with telescopes?" Quite a surprise. What for? Because Robin was stopping by so often, and he was, as we found out, was one of the biggest cocaine dealers on the West Coast. Our friend had told the cops, "Not Earl Brown, I'll find out what's going on." So Earl told him the whole story, and he told the cops, and he met with them, and they wanted him to report any new faces or movements, which he did. It must have gotten too hot, and they moved on, but every time he had a close bout with death, he would stop to see Earl. Oh, just a little footnote. One time or other, each of the boys stayed with us and ended up accepting the Lord. Robin died about 4 years ago, and according to the boys, he had accepted the Lord. So during this time, I'd still been going to church on Sundays. I had Brad back from Montana, and he was working at Mart, and he would pick up what I needed and brought me groceries. Finally, about 4 years from Earl's homegoing, we had a wood kitchen stove, and I still do. I would put him close and put a chunk in that hopefully would last till we got back from church. And he asked me if I would not go. I had to think a couple of minutes because that was my only outing. The look on his face, I knew I couldn't leave him alone anymore at all. And has the Lord as great delight in burnt offering and sacrifice as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. Mm-hmm. And I truly believe that the Lord works to us as women through your husband. Mm-hmm. He's not always right, but if you obey and with a good attitude, then the Lord can use you as a tool to work with your husband, which is really neat.
Did you want to share that?
Oh, okay. And my prayer to God, I knew my husband was going downhill pretty fast, and so my prayer to God was, Lord, please help me to be able to keep him home here at home, and Lord, if it be possible, I want to be with him when you come to take him home. So, and then the next story here is, in November, I noticed he was getting weaker, and that's when I prayed that prayer. I called the doctor that God had so graciously provided from the church. He stopped by and checked him, and he said it was congestive heart failure. It was just a matter of time. And watching your beloved getting weaker and knowing you can't do anything to help him. And I, being a farmer's wife, fought for life with baby chicks, calves, and whatever. that was sick, and you can't do anything when it's like that. By the second week in December, he couldn't talk anymore. He was too weak, and he was having a hard time swallowing. Gina's husband had to go to New York on business, so she came out to be with me the last week. And he was unable to swallow at all. A friend came and gave him a shot for the pain, as he was in terrible pain. It didn't do any good, and so Saturday morning, Brad and Gina had to go to town. I had been up all night putting ice chips in his mouth, and he was still in pain. And I said, Lord, what can I do for him? And I got all these paper clips to put the stories together. The kids had been there the day before, and they'd had pumpkin pie and whipped cream. And there was a little left, and it was almost like the Lord says, well, that whipped cream would work. So I mashed the pain pill, mixed it with whipped cream, and he was able to let it melt down his throat. Outside, the sky was leaden and dark, a few snowflakes falling. About 45 minutes later, I could see him beginning to relax and go to sleep. I'd been up all night feeding him ice chips and doing whatever, and now I was falling asleep in the chair. So I decided it would be better to climb up on my side of the bed and catch a nap. I'd be right there in case he woke up. It was about 10 o'clock a.m. I went sound asleep. It was about 1 o'clock when I woke up with a start, as though someone had woke me up. I sat bolt upright in bed, and I looked over at my husband. His eyes were open, and he was looking out the window. He was breathing normal. I laid my hand on his forehead so he would know I was there. And then I laid back down. Then I realized he was no longer breathing. God had woke me up so I could be with him when he took him home. I spent about 15 or 20 minutes just talking with God and say goodbye. Then I called my son Bruce's wife, and she got a hold of Bruce, and he had told me to do that, and he would take care of everything else. All of the family got there, and the sheriff had to ask strange questions. They always have to make sure it's not murder. My son Wayne and family arrived from Montana on Monday and brought our oldest daughter with them. And I've got precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. And that's Psalm 116:15. And then we had him, my sons dug the grave for him and did all of the things that needed to be done, and the hearse brought him out, in the hearse. And my sons and sons-in-law carried him over to the grave. And then we had a pastor did a service for him. And then the ladies all went back to the house, my house, where I had a turkey in the oven or something, and we had a dinner prepared. And my sons and son-in-laws had shovels, and they covered their dad. And I think it was a very great relief to them, and it kind of was a finish, I don't know
Closure.
exactly how to put it.
Good closure.
A closure, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I needed.
Yeah.
And at the service, we had a memorial the next day at the church. And the gentleman who did the service, he had been in the hippie movement, and he told how he and some other hippies were helping another hippie build his house. And we had come bringing a gift for their new baby, how it had affected him to see a redneck and his wife do that.
Can I ask how old was Earl when he passed away?
He was 65.
65.
I was 56.
And how long had he been disabled?
Almost 20 years.
20 years. It's a long time. Yeah.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
Um, and then, let's see.
Do you want me to, can we take some questions?
Sure.
Okay. So. Yes, Linda.
When you were sitting up there where you're sitting now with Judy Slaughter, was Earl still living then?
No.
He was already gone.
Hmm. Yeah, because I didn't get to go back to church then until after he had passed.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that was the thing that Judy told me was that I'd been a better witness being at home than and never seeing anyone than if I'd been going to church all that time because I was being obedient.
Mm-hmm. And as your prayer when you were younger, Lord, where's my witness? I don't see
Right.
anyone.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see the generations, not only of your family, but the generations that have watched you,
Right.
as we have grown up. That's an amazing witness. And just obedient to your husband when it wasn't, you didn't demand any of your rights. You didn't.
No. In fact, I really think a lot of times, in fact, there was one time when I was talking with a really sweet Christian lady about my situation, how the house was so unfinished and my daughter needed some room or and she agreed with me, and I don't think she should have. I think she should have said, it's the Lord's will, so face it. Seriously, I mean, it was the Lord's will for us to live like that because I learned so many things about, I could give you a list of things that I learned as far as household things. I mean, I learned how to cure hams, I learned how to water glass eggs, I learned how to can, I learned, all of this stuff. And I think a lot of times nowadays, women think they have to work out of the home and there's so many things they can do at home. Of course, you don't have to anymore because you have dishwashers, you have automatic washers and dryers, you have...
And when you talked about your washing that you were doing and taking it up to the clothesline, was that an electric washer? Or
It was
that
electric, but it's the old wringer type.
the wringer? Okay.
One time I caught my fingers in the wringer. But I had a baby on one hip, but I was able to get over and knock the thing to turn it loose. But I have heard of people having their fingers go, and I think it was a little kid that this one lady, she was letting him put the wash. I don't know why she would let him do that, but it got his fingers and it went right up and was peeling the skin off of his thigh. So
Well, what I remember about you is how hard you worked. So how did you learn all those things before the internet? Teach the next generation. So like curing hams and doing all the things that you had to do to basically survive and feed your children. How did you learn those things?
from books.
Books? Library friends?
No,
Or
not necessarily library.
just books?
I just somehow got books.
Mm-hmm. You had the resources. Yeah.
Yeah, I was able to get a book on how to cure meats and do all that kind of stuff. And then water glassing the eggs, I had heard about that, and I got the water glass, of course, is something that you use to plug the holes in your radiator of your car. And what it does is it seals the eggs so that air can't get into them and
So
spoil
it's a way
them.
to preserve the eggs.
It's a way to preserve the eggs.
Yeah.
And you mix it, I think it was like 9 quarts of water and 1 quart of this water glass. And then you would put the eggs in it as they came. And they really weren't solid enough to use for fried eggs, but they were great for scrambled eggs or baking
Wow.
and that kind of thing.
So I also remember when I was younger that as I was sitting in the audience with Judy and some of the other gals and you up front, and myself with my 2 children and my lovely home being overwhelmed. And I remember asking you, how did you not get overwhelmed? And And your answer was, I don't know, you probably don't remember your answer, but it was, I would just work until 9 o'clock and then everything's done. So there was a point you could just stop, but I just was so amazed at that you were not complaining about working till 9 o'clock or working on whatever, all the things you had to do. And
we had big dreams. We really, that's when we bought the place and we moved into that cabin.
Mm-hmm.
We had big dreams. We figured we could do anything,
Yes.
And we eventually did.
Mm-hmm.
And the house wasn't completely finished until just before I sold it, which was after Earl's death. I just felt I didn't want to be a slave to the farm anymore, and the house was pretty big, and so I sold.
Yeah.
And moved
And that
in.
was, and most of the time that you lived there and worked in your household, half of it was dirt floor, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. We were building it as we could afford it.
Right.
We didn't want to go into debt.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that's one story I haven't told you yet. Well, that was coming up after Earl had passed away.
Oh.
Yeah.
I know. Is there any other questions while you're looking for a story? You have time for a couple more.
Okay. Well, this one should be pretty good too.
They're all good.
Brad was still at home, but was going to be gone for a week. And I had gone to town and had not left a light on, and it was after dark when I got home. I got out of the car, wondering how I was going to handle this, remembering my poor mom would go to bed at dark, locking her bedroom door as well as the rest of the house. If you took her someplace, when you came back, you had to check underneath all the beds and closets before you left. And this little voice said, you can either check all your closets and look underneath all the beds every time you go someplace, or you can just trust me. Mm-hmm. I chuckled, and I replied, that sounds like too much work. And then a couple of weeks later, lying in bed and hearing creaking noises in the house, and it sounded like footsteps going upstairs, and it kind of startled me. And then I remembered the other, and I said, Lord, that's your problem, not mine. And I turned over and went to sleep. I think we have to take that step of faith. And when I turned over, he put me to sleep.
Perfect peace. Yes, you have a question.
So, is that right that for like 20 years while your husband was ill, that you are still providing for the family? Like, he wasn't able to work.
No.
So
And
there was no income.
no, there wasn't.
But
And he got, I think it was $2,600 from the insurance for being 100% disabled.
Total 26.
Mm-hmm. And between that and I don't remember what else, we made it through until the Social Security came through. But it took 2 years for that. And then when it finally did come through,
Talking to the microphone.
then you get a retroactive to when you first applied. And that was my story that I was going to tell next. We put that in the bank, and we tried to decide whether we should put it into the house and finish it off a little. We wouldn't completely finish it, but it would take it quite a ways. Probably give us some indoor bathrooms and stuff like that. Or we should pay the place off, because we still owed quite a bit on it. And we finally put out a fleece to find out what the Lord's will would be, and what we said was, this was in probably about September, we said, if you cause the people who own the mortgage on the place to write to us and tell us that they would take a lesser amount by the 1st of January, we'll pay it off. And if they don't, then we'll go ahead and put it into the house. And about the 1st of December, we get this letter saying that the man who owned the mortgage had died and that his heirs would like to be paid off. So we wrote back and asked if they would take a certain amount. They said they would, so we paid it off. So we didn't finish our house.
When did you get indoor bathrooms?
It probably was...
I love that you don't remember.
I don't remember. It should have been a big hallelujah. But
I love it. I love it. Janice.
You ran all the time because I would see you on...
that was after my husband died, before I started.
That's what I was going to ask. When did you start running?
After my husband had passed away. I walked a little bit, well, I guess you could call it walking when you were irrigating, going up and down the hill irrigating, because it was all on a hillside. And but yes, I didn't start running until after.
You were a faithful runner because I saw you all the
Every day.
Well, after my husband had passed away, I was pretty isolated during the time that he was so sick. And I knew that I had to start moving out and doing new things. And that's one reason I started doing that. I went and took a class in wood shop, and I told the instructor that I wanted to build myself a bed, and I think he thought I wanted him to build the bed, because he avoided me like a plague. And so he got me onto the lathe, and I started working on it, and I ended up making all the parts for my bed. Nice. Then my son helped me put it together. But the instructor didn't do any of it. I did it. And it was really fun. I really enjoyed it. I'd like to do more woodworking, but it just never happened. And in the album over there, I have a picture of the bed that I made.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to pray for you, and then we'll have time for questions after. But if you have children, I'm afraid you need to go pick them up, but then you can come back in if you have more questions for her. So, Lord, I just lift up Kareen, and I just testify that her witness is bright and shiny for you, Lord. I thank you for your faithfulness in all of the things that she has walked through, and the voice that she has heard in you, that she obeyed, and she walked faithfully with you, Lord. What an encouragement that is. And I just pray that every single member of her family would just understand that how valuable that is for them. And I thank you for her. I thank you for her family. For each one, Lord, would you just bless them? Would you continue to give her strength according to the number of her days, Lord? Thank you for her testimony, for her faithfulness, for the sweetness of her heart, Lord, towards you. And we just ask that you would just bring these things to remembrance, Lord, as we need encouragement. Thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Debbie.
Yes, thank you.